hearing a bit about, for example, ADHD and the executive function deficits that exist with ADHD and how that might overlap with.
Okay, that's three now, exception. You're only allowed two. See? They limited it, didn't they? It's even more than that with gifted. They are, yeah, they all overlap. Yeah. Executive functioning, ADD. Actually, ADD basically is executive function issues generally.
Exactly, but just how that overlaps with giftedness.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay, good.
I think I'm interested in role in anxiety and how that sort of feeds into or correlates or causation. Those
All the above.
Yeah.
Correlates,
How
feeds
to
into.
isolate what to treat and what to help support.
That's a very good question. We get that question every day in our work. And generally, you know, we treat both, and we treat one over the other based on the assessment that we do. Terms of where the person's at. But we need to talk a lot about anxiety. Hold on one second. Back to that issue of twice exceptional. You know, I'm one of the people who created that field. And I don't like the term because, as you mostly will know, that your kids are probably far more than twice exceptional, and that's why you're here tonight. There's a lot more exceptionality than two things going on there, and that's where it gets really complicated.
Does diet and exercise affect one's executive function?
Yes, totally.
And how?
That's Dr. Smith has to answer that question. Go ahead. What do you want to say?
We're not answering questions yet. We're just
We're not answering it.
I'm buying myself some time.
Cool.
We're getting, like, you know, diet and exercise is totally involved in the whole process. And unfortunately, there's this thing called computer games.
Yeah.
That's a diet. That's not working.
It comes down to neurobiology in the end, but we'll say more about that later.
Thank you.
So giftedness for me is all neurology at some level. Well, there's more to it than that, but it's a huge part of it.
Will you be addressing potential misdiagnosis of gifted?
I could. The misdiagnosis of which part? The giftedness or the other stuff? Or
Of the
all
ADHD.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. If the issue is assessment, how people assess the problem to start with, a lot of misdiagnosis comes from people just aren't trained on how to address and assess that issue.
I just, piggybacking on that, I just wonder if you have any feelings or thoughts about how the system drives the diagnosis. That in order
Well,
to
that's
get-
my life's work.
In order
So-
to get, but so that in order to get support, people need a main
Yes, they do.
pathology in order
To get what they need.
So even if someone's gifted, they want to pigeonhole, I mean, someone does, they think they're helping the child by putting them in that place. So I don't know if you see that.
Every day, all different sides of that coin, and then you have to make crazy decisions about those things, and you have to counsel families on how to deal with that dilemma. That's a huge dilemma. And yeah, so I'm in a school about once a week at an IEP or a team meeting or a parent-teacher conference, working on those kind of issues. Do you want to go? We can go ahead and start, and then you're going to introduce, and then I'll come back here.
Yeah, we have to do the big unveil.
Yeah, there, go for it. Yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started, and I think some other people can filter in the back. Thank you all for coming tonight, especially for braving the weather. At least it wasn't last night. We're really excited to have another night of our speaker series, and we just wanted to welcome you as part of the Chicago Gifted Community Center. We are a 501(c), completely parent-run volunteer organization that seeks to create community, make connections, help with resources, and provide support for gifted children and their families. We see some people that we recognize, and thank you for your continued support. We're happy that you made it out again. And if this is your first CGCC event, we have some information on the back table. Please take a look at it. And if you see people with badges, name tags, badges on, we're the board members. Grab us afterwards if you have any questions or suggestions or anything you want to talk about. We're available.
Could you give the full name of your organization?
Chicago Gifted Community Center, CGCC. So one reason we're able to do events like these tonight is through the generosity of volunteers, of experts, people who are willing to give their time to come and talk to us about things that pertain to giftedness, such as Andy Mahoney, who is a nationally recognized counselor and pioneer in the field of gifted education. He is currently the director for the, I never get it right, Center for Identity Potential. I always want to say the potential for identity.
We like that too.
I've actually heard you speak a couple of times, and I'm really excited to hear about executive function, and I'm sure everyone will really enjoy it. So turn it over.
Okay, so we're back to work.
Go back to work. Get started.
All right, let's talk about, can you hear me okay or no? Should I, is that any better? Y'all be really quiet. No. All right, so let's talk about joining associations first of all, because this group has brought us together. And one of the problems with gifted education is that when the funding went out in Illinois, and 10 years ago or so, whatever it was, it's been a long time now, people got discouraged and parent groups dropped off, and that's how I made my money. Okay, but here's the deal. Gifted education exists in this country because of parents, period. Generally, it's parent groups who brought the issue to the table in education. It wasn't the people in education. Why? Because we're very small in numbers. Because it's a small segment of the population. And it was creating a critical mass through parents. So I really encourage people, if you're not a member of this group or any group, then in your area you should join one or create one. Because that is the biggest way to make change in gifted education, is parents getting together and supporting the issue. It does work, the power of one and then two and all together. If you're also not familiar with the Illinois Association for Gifted, I highly recommend that you join that organization as a parent of a gifted child. And they're having a conference coming up in February. Does anybody have the details in their head? February 9th? It's early. But it is in, what town's it in? I'm blanking. Naperville. So it's local. And what's nice about state association conferences, they're small, but they bring in big name people. Because the people who are in gifted education like to travel to different states and speak, and you can go there and get not just your local expertise, but you'll get other people from around the country. And they're geared for, not just for teachers, they do gear the conferences for parents. So anybody here is a teacher tonight, by the way? A teacher, great. And then how many are here as parents? All right, good. And anybody here as a gifted individual looking for, okay. Are you gifted, by the way? Oh, this is interesting. The numbers are low. But you have gifted kids. There's something wrong with that equation. So, all right, well, first, I guess, are we rolling here? Are we going? All right, let me introduce myself a little more. I'm Andy Mahoney. I am one of the people who helped create the field of counseling the gifted. That has been my life's work. I've been doing it for about 30 years. And so I specialize in the counseling and psychotherapy of the gifted. I'm also a professional, at times, pastel artist. Any pastel artists in the crowd? We've got a couple. Cool. Okay, we're unique. We're even, we're very, very unique out there. Tonight we're going to talk about executive function in the gifted, and I'm sure we'll deviate into other topics because I know what parent groups are like on the gifted. I'll do my best to keep up with you. And we won't cover every single thing because you're insatiable people. Right? That's part of being gifted. So I'll talk really fast at times and try to cram a lot in. I don't mind questions. If I am on a roll, though, because of my own executive function processing issues, if you do ask me a question and I feel intrigued to answer it, I will go off on a tangent and I may ask you to get me back on track. So that's just part of my nature. Eventually I'll get back there and that. So everybody's pretty settled. Now about those cards on your seat. Those cards are really important to me. I have literally thousands and thousands of them. Every parent talk I do, I have parents write down, teachers, whoever, write down your burning question. And then I need to get my friends here to collect them. Okay? And then when you're ready, we'll give you a few minutes here maybe. If you got them, pass them in and we'll do another round in a minute.
Yours?
All right. So those cards are also a good opportunity for people who are introverts, who just want to ask really weird questions and don't want to be acknowledged in the audience. And I'll answer questions about anything, design, interior design, landscaping, stuff I don't even know anything about. Just throw the question in there. I'll make it sound like I do. Right. Wow, this is a really nice crowd of people. How are we doing? All right, so, but before we go any further, any more burning questions you want to put in my brain as I like to have a little preset in my head.
So I really work a lot with gifted, people as well, kids and adults, and one of the areas I'm very interested in is looking at dyslexia and dysgraphia, and just looking at learning differences instead of labeling everyone psychiatrically. Because I work a lot with kids and go to schools as well, and I find that often no one's really looking at the underlying differences in learning styles and multiple intelligences, and instead people are being labeled psychiatrically, and kids especially being put on drugs. I do lectures on non-drug approaches. But I'm just wondering if you know good people in the area here who do testing for
Well,
dyslexia,
let's see.
dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and learning
Testing and
differences.
Andy. All right. We'll, that's a tough one. All right, I'll tell you about me in testing. I am very unusual. So I've been using testing, neuropsych testing, my whole career. That's not normal for counselors, therapists, psychologists, even psychologists to believe in testing as a part of the process. So when I talk about the testing that I do, it is not what I expect everybody else to do because of my specialization. So virtually 90-some% of my clientele gets neuropsych tested, which is unheard of in a clinical practice, right? There's a reason I do that. And there's a reason I'm very particular about the kind of testing that we do. So Jennifer, Dr. Smith is my colleague here, and we vet virtually any tester we come across to see what their work is like in relationship to the work that we're doing. So there are a couple people in the Chicago area that we would refer to. We basically send most of our work back to Washington, D.C. to a center there called Stixrud Associates. And Bill Stixrud runs that. It's the best neuropsych testing facility, I think, in the country. And the reason it is because he literally, he's got about 16 psychometricians, and he trains them on a regular basis, and they have access to every battery there is, which is really hard for neuropsych people to get because they're very expensive. And typically around here, you'll see a neuropsych person do maybe 15 batteries. And so they're kind of limited to their menu. When we do our assessments back there, the people who do them, they have access to 25, 40, 50 batteries. And the process is very different. It's based off of many, many years of working specifically with gifted kids so they're not mislabeled or assessed the wrong way. And we literally make sure everything is ruled out. So, our philosophy is when you come to us, we know you've been through this mill. We know you've talked to multiple experts. And most of those people give you pieces of the picture. And I want to make sure when we work with you that you have it down as a parent or as an individual. That you really do have a great baseline of understanding about your learning style, your learning profile. We call it a learning profile. And we work with labels very strategically. You were mentioning, the gentleman next to you, you were mentioning the issue about when somebody's labeled. The reality is at times we want kids to be labeled in the district, and sometimes we don't. And that's case specific. There's no one way to do that. There's a complicated way to work on that, and we work very delicately on that issue about how we handle that. And a lot of people get worried about labels because they're afraid the label's going to carry them forever. And I've been in the business 30 years. I've never seen anybody's label in school carry into their adulthood. If you have a unique story, that's fine, tell me, but I've never heard a story. I've talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of you. So I don't get too worried about the label other than the way the person internalizes the label as an identity. So we're not talking about identity tonight, but that's the basis of my work. It's all about identity. So I don't like when people have a construed identity. I want them to have an identity that fits them. I prefer the gifted identity over a psychiatric label identity. So somebody will come in who's gifted and they have that much ADD in the realm of who they are and how they're expressing themselves. But that's their identity, and I don't want that. I'd rather have a chunk of it be gifted. That's a part of who I am in terms of how I express myself. And I'm just a human being, really, right? Like everybody else. Everybody has their own kind of profile, so to speak. I won't get into learning style issue, but I don't know if you're aware of this, but the learning styles movement is dead, basically. What's happening in neuroscience is people are realizing we're all human. And what we all have is human nature. And the way I look at it is it's all human nature in extremes. Different varying degrees of development in nature, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, but that was a good starter. Does that answer some questions about assessment of me? I don't expect everybody necessarily, by the way, to go out, run out and get the kind of assessment that we utilize, because not everybody can do that. But I do it for a reason. And does that look familiar? Whose desk is that?
It's my desk.
It's your desk? I've seen your desk. It's not that bad.
Pretty bad.
But this is what, you know, but they,
Information in my daughter's brain.
yes, that's a good way to look at it. I've never looked at it that way.
That's the information is, so she can't pull hold of the paper out, figure out what to do with it. She's just throwing the paper.
This is my daughter. Say that last part again. Just come on in. Say that last part again, though, about writing. I want to talk about that
She
too.
can't, that would be the information that she would have, and she couldn't pull that piece of paper out in order to figure out how to write a paper.
Exactly. She can't retrieve, can she?
Oh,
All right, now we're into it. Here, Garrett, I want you to do this. You're going to read through the questions first, and then pick out a few for me to answer later. Okay? All right, yes, that's love. This person, she knows exactly where everything is, right? And you know, let me tell you something. There's some truth in that, and sometimes that's okay, relative. Like I'm an artist, and my palette is all over the place, my pastels. Now, the brains are different between men and women too, so typically female artists, and this isn't always the case, but generally, their palettes are organized very differently. They have much more of an organizing, but for me, no. I know exactly where everything is on that palette, and that's the way I work. So that's kind of the way my palette is, but I can't work the other way. It's too much not me. So in some cases, this works for people to a relative degree. Sometimes people just want you to think that it works for them. Hello, Mira. And it doesn't, you know? It's really, they're just wasting a lot of energy and speed and time, and their executive function is really struggling. You know, this always reminds me of an old friend of mine. She worked for 5 of the top companies in the world. She was extremely brilliant, and she was extremely challenged when it comes to executive function. And she, you know, back in the day, 20-some years ago, she made between $350,000 and $500,000 a year. But she was so disorganized that she couldn't take a part of that salary and hire a personal assistant to work for her and to accommodate for her. So she got fired from 5 top companies, and she ended up, by the way, as a professor in education somewhere. But it's very interesting how people can't deal with executive function issues in their life. And that, for the gifted person, is very difficult, because they have trouble accepting those realities. So what is gifted, by the way? My mom says I'm gifted, and the other kid says, is that why she dresses you that way? Is that your kid? Is that you? Did you do a bow on your kid? I've seen that. Basically, the reason I put that out there is people don't really understand what giftedness is. People have conceptions about giftedness that it's all about academic achievement, academic performance, and I want to say something. I'm not into the performance model, you know, and there are people here, I'm sure, that came to figure out how to make their kid perform better. And I'm sure that if you came to this talk, you don't totally believe that, but you might know some people outside of here that believe that. But it's not about performance. It's about helping the child become who they are and find a way to develop themselves as a whole person and to learn better in the reality of the world they're living in, and to really help them understand what we call their asynchronous nature. Have you heard that term, asynchrony and giftedness? Okay, so up here is the bell curve that I typically, some of you have heard this before, but I'll go over it for those who haven't. Basically, that dotted line, by the way, that goes up there, that's called the asynchrony curve. That was coined by me, and I'm going to explain it to you in a minute. But the middle of the curve is where most people fall generally in terms of ability, human nature, intelligence, those kinds of things, talent. And then as you get further off to both sides of that continuum, things become deviant. Things are not normal in essence. So we're looking primarily at the right side of that curve tonight. And on the right side of that curve is what we typically talk about as giftedness, extreme ability, talent, those kind of things. So that first circle you see to the right, that's what we call what do I call it? Help me out. Optimal gifted, thank you. Glad you're there. That's my retrieval there. That's called external working memory retrieval person. You should all have a few in the audience planted. All right. So back to that circle up there. Those are the kind of kids that teachers love to teach, parents love to have. Why? Because they're just far enough from the norm to be high performers. They do well in school. They challenge authority just enough to be cute, but not to do any serious damage like I do. And that's what we like, typically. And that's our model in the sense of what we think a gifted child should be. Seriously. But the reality is this. The further out you get, the more it's not like that. The more it starts to rock and roll. And what happens developmentally and neurologically and physiologically, all that kind of stuff, is the person's development is out of sync. So they come into the world with some areas that are way ahead and other areas that are literally way behind. Now, you hear a lot of people talk about acceleration, advanced development, and all those things. That is not Andy Mahoney's view of giftedness. I don't look at giftedness as just accelerated ability or prodigious ability. I look at the whole picture. I look at it as this asynchronous developmental thing, and advanced development that you see in a gifted child is only a piece of the puzzle, and it's actually quite dangerous just to focus on that. Because the areas that they're lagging behind in reality, later in life, could actually be their greatest gifts. So if you have a gifted child who's way out there in somebody's determination or your own, then what you have basically is what we call a lot of scatter in their profile. So in some areas they're way ahead, in some areas they're way behind. You might not even know that they're way behind because they're compensating. And all the focus is going where? On their advanced development. That is very dangerous, folks. We want to change that whole paradigm. And by the way, the people who created that paradigm about advanced development, they created this whole asynchronous thing. They don't even talk about it like I do. They don't talk about the vulnerabilities. They put a lot of focus still on the advanced issues. And they want to put a lot of energy in that direction. The problem is this. The more you focus on the gift and the strength, eventually the gaps basically start to show up. And they get worse. And eventually the child implodes. So if you know anything about the life of a prodigy, I'm an artistic prodigy. The research is real clear. About the age of 19 or 20, they burn out. That's my story. Went to art school, full scholarship, star student, quit. Done. Why? Because that process gets way out of sync. And in order to maintain the self and survive, you got to do what? You've got to work that out. And everybody else wants you to keep going. It doesn't work that way developmentally. You know, so what happens basically is the person either figures it out or they never do. So all I have to do is ask the question, which I've done before. Have you ever known somebody growing up who was exceptionally talented or gifted, and you know as an adult they never basically fulfilled that potential? Every single person in this room, think about the numbers of people in the world. I can ask 500 people and the vast majority of them will raise their hand or not. So we have a huge issue out there with giftedness in terms of what we're not dealing with. And this is why we're not dealing with it. Because basically we're looking at that curve and we're not understanding how asynchronous development works. So really the rule of thumb is this. The further out you are, the more out of sync you are. And what your perceived weaknesses are, and that's the only time I'll use the word, they're not really weaknesses, they're vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities could actually, like I said earlier, be your greatest gift down the road in life. And people don't quite get that until they see the lifespan of a gifted person. And so I'm one of the people who introduced the concept of giftedness across the lifespan. Because that's what it's about. You're not gifted up until you leave school. You're a gifted person, you're a deviant. And you're a deviant your whole life. I mean that in a good way. Anybody have a problem with the word deviant, by the way? I like to be called that, a deviant. I like being a deviant, but you know, that's my particular taste. You don't like being a deviant?
It's like an association.
Everybody associates anything, which is very fascinating, isn't it? So this is how human beings conceptualize deviance. Basically one way, negative. And the reality is this, you're deviants. You are a deviant in a general sense, in some relative way. So what's happening to the gifted person is they come into the world and they're a deviant. So then what happens is everybody relates to them a certain way, unconsciously mostly. People unconsciously don't know what to do with your deviance. They don't know what to do with your bizarre child, right? Your deviant child, your child that can't regulate themselves. in the middle of the street, they don't know what to do with that person. They don't know how to understand that's gifted. Some of you get it though, right? You figured it out. Some of them get caught up in the shame, you know, the shame of having a child that, why can't my gifted child just be good at math and science and get all A's and go to Harvard? Well, that's a very few percentage of gifted people actually end up doing that. It's very tiny. So I'm here to say embrace your deviance, and it's a good thing. And that's issues to work out. That's another talk, by the way. We can talk about it. I'll come back if you'd like. All right, so there's gaps that occur. They can be developmental delays. They can be skill deficits. They can basically be neurological issues. They can be some kind of an over-reliance on the gift, and then the issues, things that are just generally behind it, get worse because there's so much focus. And they look like, they act like, they smell like a learning disability. They can be labeled as one, which is fine, as long as you understand what the gifted, it doesn't mean it's going to be that way the rest of their life. If somebody's in the middle of the bell curve and they get diagnosed with a learning disability, more than likely they have that on some relative way the rest of their life. It doesn't mean they can't do something with it or about it, but it doesn't have the same developmental trajectory as it does if you're a gifted individual. The other thing that happens with people in this situation is they have increased anxiety, increased impulsivity, any predispositions they have to depression, any kind of genetic DNA kind of thing that's going on with them can get activated in the stress. So I'm a big believer in epigenetics, and if you don't want, if you want, go out and read some stuff on epigenetics. It's great stuff, and you'll understand the process of what happens to gifted people when they come up against all the systems in the world and when they don't know themselves and how to regulate themselves in relationship to all those variables.
I'm sorry, what did you call that? Epigenetics?
Epigenetics? Yeah, they're great. There's some good books out there.
EPI.
EPIs.
Sorry.
It's my auditory processing and part of that. Pronouncing it
No, you're
well
not.
enough.
Great.
Oh, I did that? Oh, okay. Epigenetics. Bruce Lipton's book is pretty good. I like that, Biology of Belief. And I have another one I'm reading right now, which is more of a primary source research book, but I can't think of the name of it. But if you email me, I send it to you. Okay. Do you know any others? Molecules of Emotion is a great
That's
book.
not epigenetics, but it's a great book.
Yeah,
Molecules
it's
of-
kinda-
I've heard.
if you read one, you should read Molecules of Emotion. Do you like it? Are you reading it, right? Yeah. Have you read that one, anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, she was one, she just died, that woman. Unfortunately, at a very young age, yeah. Yeah, it's really sad, because she's making a great contribution. But that's a good one for people who are gifted to read. They get that. All right, so what we're really talking about here with executive function is the achievement gap. It's people have ability, but they don't have capability. And primarily, gifted people don't have the capability because generally, I don't like to generalize too much, but a big chunk of the problems are executive function related behaviors. There's other issues that come into play, but tonight we're going to focus on that. But that is a big one in terms of this gap. It's a lot of people like to put a lot of it on psychological factors with the gifted. Believe me, I'm well trained in that realm. If I thought it was all psychological, I'd tell you. It's not. So this is the deal with executive function. This is the prefrontal cortex of the brain. I'm not going to get into the hard science of it because I'm not really totally that good at Dr. Smith is. So if she has any questions about the brain, she'll answer them for me. But here's how I look at it. This is the control room up here, the prefrontal cortex. This is where basically everything that is processed gets used or worked out. It's like your command center of the brain. In most human beings, it does not develop fully until their late 20s. Now, let's think about it this way. So physiologically, it doesn't develop fully. And the insurance people know this too, by the way. Impulse control, all kinds of executive function issues. Let's go back to asynchronous development. Here's what happens generally. Girls, physiologically, advance faster than boys. We kind of know that in human nature. Executive function, it has a lot to do with physiological development. So girls who are gifted tend to be, generally, I'm generalizing a bit, good at sports. They tend to be good with executive function. But when they have a problem with executive function, here's the problem. They compensate better. So no one believes that the gifted girl really could have issues with executive function. You're nodding your heads. Well, welcome to my career. I can sit in a room with a whole family, and I can say, well, how's your daughter? Oh, she's fine, don't worry about her, right? And all I have to do is listen to the stress. Problems with the girlfriend, problems with the teacher, problems with the boyfriend, all the stressors in her life. All of that is secondary effect to an executive function problem. Because we know now, I've always said this, most marital problems are related to executive function. Processing information, communicating is related to executive function. So somebody came out with some great research on ADHD and marital problems, and they proved it, and I was right, like normal, you know? Right? So it all gets back to that. But here's the deal for boys. Again, human behavior in extremes developmentally. So boys, what? They lag behind girls physiologically. In gifted land, giftedness is about human behavior in extremes. So for boys, they become the squeaky wheel, and they become the problem, and they act out, and they get attention for it, and it's obvious because they're too stupid to hide it. No, I'm just kidding. Girls hide it better, though. That's my point, which I really am concerned about because the research proves that. So when a gifted girl has a learning problem, it doesn't get diagnosed, typically until college, if ever at all, and I've seen that in my whole career, over and over and over. And the other thing, and then it becomes embedded into psychological issues, denial, defense postures, things like that. And then that gets tricky because nobody wants to go there. And you have to be a really masterful counselor to help a gifted girl face that reality, and you have to have good assessment. If you do not have good assessment with a brilliant person, particularly a girl who's in that condition, you will not succeed. Because they have to see it from another source. Because all they think you're after is psychobabble and labeling them and really trying to find something wrong with them. And the reality is when they see the hard data and it's done well, they figure it out because they're smart and they start to connect the dots and we help them understand that. But the sad thing is there's a relationship between this, by the way, and eating disorders and gifted girls. There's research out there. I've known this research for years, and people who work with eating disorders kind of know this research, but they still don't make it a variable in their treatment process. And that's my whole claim to fame. Intelligence is a variable in the counseling process. If you ignore a person's nature in the process of helping them in this, you're not going to counsel them effectively because it's a huge part of their struggle. And it is a variable in the eating disorder world in terms of what they're dealing with. And all you have to do is look at the neuropsych profiles of those people and you'll see the problems right there. But again, the focus is going to be on what? Pathology, not on development. I'm a developmentalist if you haven't figured that out. Okay, executive function ability does not equal intelligence. Let's make that clear. It's the opposite, really. Executive dysfunction equals intelligence. You know, I'm generalizing a bit, but you know what? I can do that because it's true. You know, you think about the classic absent-minded professor, you know, that's an example of a brilliant person with executive function issues. They're brilliant, but they're dysfunctional as all get out, and that's because of the nature of who they are. And that's okay to some degree, except if it's your exam and they forgot to put the right grade on your records, and you have to spend hours and hours fighting with the dean to get that corrected, and at that point, the professor has lost your papers, right? That happens to people, doesn't it? All the time, you know? So I just want you to make sure that you don't correlate it with that. The other thing you brought up in the car you forgot to mention was moral failure. I'll just talk about it right this second because we can't forget it. When people are struggling with functioning in the gifted world and they can't achieve up to, quote, their potential, whether internally imposed or externally, they feel like a moral failure. And you don't get that right away on the surface. When do you get it? After you get to help them really understand themselves and you get a better relationship with them. Even with your own kids, you won't see it. I mean, I've been in sessions with families where eventually the kid learns to speak and the kid eventually learns how to express their feelings, and what typically comes out is their sense of failure, their sense that they've disappointed you and they've disappointed themselves and they feel like they failed, that somehow morally they're not okay because they're not performing well. That is a huge problem for people who struggle with executive function related issues. So let's talk about the overlap of those. They're enormous. This is the direction where it's all going. ADHD, nonverbal learning disabilities, auditory processing, sensory, autism spectrum, Asperger's, OCD. See all that stuff? All of those are related in some way to the prefrontal cortex. So really, all human beings struggle with executive function. We could have anybody here tonight in any realm of ability, range, or nature, and we all deal with executive function. And by the way, our society is going in the direction where we're making it worse. everything we're doing today is counter to what we need to do to develop executive function. It's just unreal, and don't get me on that too much tonight because you'll get really overwhelmed, won't they? Yes. We will talk about note-taking, though, in a few minutes. All right, so we're going to go through these. These are the subfunctions of the prefrontal cortex of executive function. You don't have to read them all right now, but just look them over. We're going to talk about each one. If you have like examples, throw them, as we talk, you can throw them out. All right, initiating. This is the starter button. Now, has anybody here ever had a problem with themselves or a kid getting started? I'll get you. Go have a drink. That was the end of the night right there. Exactly, right? And guess what? You know what? Nobody's come up with solutions either to get them started, have they? Anybody have a good solution to get them started?
My mother's solution for me was always just grind it out, Lisa. When I was in school.
So she pushed you.
Just to grind
Yes.
it. I like to try not, don't worry if it's really any good. Just like produce whatever.
Right, just get you started. You know what? That's actually a good strategy, by the way. Because ultimately, that is technically what it takes to get going. Is sometimes you just have to grind it out. I like the way you said that. And some people don't like to hear that, but that is sometimes what it takes to get going.
Sometimes I tell kids that, and people I know too, that I explain to them that maybe they're just trying to be too perfectionistic about it, that they just, doesn't have to be perfect before they get going.
They are being perfectionistic, and that's a symptom of a problem. It's not an issue. See, this is what's happened with perfectionism. People talk about it. Again, it's a descriptive symptom. When somebody is perfectionistic, there's a lot going on. They are not just romantically wanting things wonderful. Yes, they do want things really at a high level and really nice. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when a person is perfectionistic, they're having a problem with their executive function in some realm.
I like to say it's not a personality trait, it's a symptom.
I like that. It's totally a symptom. And guess what? I've been to a million talks, hear my colleagues talk about perfectionism. I talk about it as a symptom. I remember one day I was working in a school and one of the counselors came to get me and they said, so-and-so's in the art room and they want to saw off their arm, they want to cut off their arm. I said, I'll be right there, I know the feeling, right? They were saying they're being really perfectionistic. They want to cut off their arm because they can't make it perfect. Well, what's really happening is this. They have a great vision, but guess what they don't have? The developed skill, period. But they have the mindset that they should be able to what? Do it perfectly. But they've never been educated, taught, understand themselves well enough to know how that plays out in their real life. But then they're told this romantic thing, perfectionism, right? Well, guess what? I want them told the real thing. The reason you can't execute is because you don't have the ability. You have it over here on certain days. Certain days I could draw like Rembrandt. And other days when I couldn't, I was an arm biter. Have you ever met an arm biter? Ever seen an arm biter? A couple of you? I was an arm biter. And that damn thing didn't draw the way I wanted it to. I'm going to fight that thing. That didn't work. What did it do? It shut down my executive function even more. It just spun it around. So this is a broken starter button. Initiating. Focusing. Okay, so you've heard this saying, well, my kid doesn't have ADD. They hyper-focus. They can focus on something so well. Yes, they can, but guess what they can't do? Transition in and out of that focus. That is a super symptom of an executive function problem. It's also a good thing to be able to do. There's nothing wrong with hyper-focusing. It's the ability to go into the focus and out of the focus and be self-monitoring, which is another subfunction, to know how to move yourself in and out of that. So that person has to be counseled in and out of that. Behavior has to be labeled. They have to understand that it's still a good trait, but the problem is the transitioning, which is a subfunction issue. Prioritization. This is a big one in gifted land. Because Mary likes to do everything. She's how do they say it? She's multi-potential. Now that's a good excuse for somebody who has trouble with prioritization. Yes, she probably does have multiple potentials, but what she doesn't have is the ability to prioritize. Because when it comes down to it, what typically happens is we typically pick 1 or 2 or 3 things, we become highly expert in them, and then we transition it to the next one and the next one and the next one. But when Mary wants to do it all at once and she gets really frustrated because she's not able to do it all at once, typically it's a symptom that she's having trouble with prioritization. Prioritization, by the way, is something you have to teach people. It's a numbers game. It's a values game. You have to do exercises. You can look them up online. But basically, you're getting people to do forced choice, values assignments in terms of that. If you want to be a good artist, you have to have executive function skills. Because when you paint, I'm a landscape painter. I was explaining this to a friend the other day. When you're looking at a landscape, it's all values. If you don't understand prioritization and values, how to create depth, your viewer can't, whether you're doing an abstract landscape or not, there's still a level of executive function involved in prioritization of how you're handling those colors and the values of those colors in the landscape. So you can't really get away from it. A lot of artists think, they don't need that crap. But in reality, they're still human beings. And eventually they figure out, you know what, it's good to learn some skills, in that regard. Somebody's like, is that a good one? Did I offend any artists in the crowd? No, Jackson Pollock. He even had a method, Jackson Pollock, right? Impulsivity, inhibition. I'll have a cure for this one. I'll tell you in a minute. All right, this is self-regulation at its max. This is your ability to hold back. And people who can't. Well, your brain, when you're gifted, you're processing pretty fast. And getting all that stuff to work together is a real problem, isn't it? You still have to be taught how to do that. You still have to be somewhere in your life put through a process where you have to regulate and learn how to regulate. You know when this really should occur? It's between 0 and 2. So, we can talk about the fundamental problem in society is this. Nobody knows how to parent a 2-year-old anymore. Some people get it. But when a child is at that age, that's when they need very strong limits, very firm limits. But if they're a gifted child at 2 and they're sweet, precocious, and they do wonderful, sweet things, who's going to interrupt that process? Right? Because we can all be seduced by the 2-year-old gifted child. But the reality is the problem has started already. But that's just for any kid in society. And then what happens is when they get older, instead of letting go of control, which you're supposed to do in adolescence, we start to try to impose more control. What does that do for a person with executive problems? It makes them crazy as a loon when you start to impose control externally on their internally undeveloped control, which wasn't put in place early on. Does anybody have any addiction to going to TJ Maxx or places like that where I see a little, okay, so here's an example. You go shopping, you're an artist, and you like to fill your palette with cool things to design with, decorate, so you go to TJ Maxx and you just buy everything you want. And you fill your cart, and then you get outside, and you've paid for all this, and you're like, oh boy, am I in trouble, right? With whoever. There's the marital thing, see? It's back to that. I'm right again, right? So here's what's happening. You go to TJ Maxx, and you take your cart, but you leave your wallet in the car, and you make sure you parked on the far end of the parking lot. And so you go in, and you start shopping. And you do like you normally do. You buy everything you want. You put it in your cart. And you're having a good old time, aren't you? And guess what? You're a little bit out of control, Unconsciously something else is going on, and I'll give that tip away. But then what happens is it's time to check out. What am I going to tell you to do? Anybody? Say that?
Leave the cart.
Leave the cart and walk out of the store. Just walk out of the store. By the time you get to the car, your frontal lobe is calmed down. Your reasoning is kicked back in. Your prioritization skills are back up online. Your pace, everything is back. All your frontal lobe functions, all your executive function is back. You can literally decide now what you really needed in the cart. And in most cases, you're going to go back for maybe 1 or 2 things, or you won't even go back. And all you have to do is do that a couple times, and you will learn real quick. That's how quick it is to train the brain. It's like getting me off gluten and sugar, right? The first week is hell. But after that, the cravings go away. People don't realize that. You can literally recondition the prefrontal cortex that fast.
It's also a dopamine thing. There's a
Yes.
rush.
Yeah, it gets out of control and out of whack. We won't get into the dopamine stuff tonight because that's her bag.
Well,
But
it's the same for gamblers. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's that key.
yeah, it's human behavior in extremes. And you know what? People who have addiction issues, there's huge comorbidity between ADD and addiction and mood disorders and all that kind of stuff with addiction. Because it's all about this, folks.
So,
Now you're starting to ask questions. Uh-oh.
yeah, so I see how to separate myself from the cart of things in the store. But looking at my 9-year-old and his propensity to, say, hit a younger sibling or the like, I cannot permanently separate
No.
him from the siblings. What?
Because if your child is hitting somebody at that level and you can't stop them with a normal behavioral regimen, then you have a problem. That's when you need to get assessment and help. Because first line of defense in that, we're not going to go off on that too much, but that's a diagnostic indicator. And then there's all kinds of other things that have to go into play. All right? But we can come back to that in a minute. Go ahead. I want to keep moving on.
I'm just trying to understand and put this in a broader context. I understand what you're talking about with regards to executive function, but I'm having a hard time teasing out, is this all gifted individuals, or is just all individuals with executive function, or who are we talking about?
Well, let's pretend we're just talking about gifted kids with executive function, but we're really talking about every human being. Now remember, it's human nature in extremes. Does that make sense? I'm just giving you the foundation of executive function at the moment.
Okay.
But if you want to, if we can twist it in anytime you want to give me an example of a gifted person and how this plays out, it's plain and simple. Let's just take goal setting, right? Goal setting is a function of the prefrontal cortex. It's something that people learn how to do, should be able to do. Now a gifted kid who has a big ideas, big goals, right? And poor executive function, what are they going to want to do? You've been here, folks. Everything. And guess what? Every time they want to do everything, you get in the same dilemma, don't you? You're overwhelmed. How do you stop them? Blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you how to stop them right now. You educate them about what we're talking about. You explain to them. You go back to, everybody can have access to these overheads, by the way. You just email me. You go back to that bell curve, and you can go back to explain to them their nature and extreme, and you can explain to them the disconnect between their brilliant ideas and the reality of where the development of their brain is. And that, guess what? That's basically what they need to start before you try to do anything else. You have to give them this information. Are they, depending on the kid, you know, we don't have any problem giving a 5-year-old things on nuclear physics. All right? I think we can give them some basics on executive function and their behavior. I don't think we're going to hurt them. But guess what? There are some people out there who would be freaked out by that idea. I hate to say it. It's just insane to me. But what gifted kids need in terms of this is the information. Because it clicks with them. It makes sense. If you explain to them their nature and you're hitting the nail on the head, they can do something with it. And then you can behaviorally intervene. But a lot of you will try to behaviorally intervene before you do stuff like that, and it will not work with a gifted child. Forget it. It won't work. Sequencing. That's the ability to follow a sequence, to put things in order. Well, when you're having an executive function challenge, you're going down the sequence, and then you have a squirrel moment, and that squirrel moment becomes a zoo, right? And we're off and running, and we never followed the sequence. Now, is that giftedness? Yes, that's giftedness. It's also the inability to regulate with that. So some of that has to be captured, and the person needs to be brought. But the person really needs to understand that they have a problem in that area. They're vulnerable in that area, I should say. Y'all were laughing. What was so funny? No, I'm just kidding. Hold on one second.
Because that's me.
That's you?
I can't follow a
You're a squirrel?
at all.
One of the things I'm thinking about is creating the environment that assists or allows the individual to develop in their own way.
Yeah, that's a dangerous phrase.
Well,
no, I'm with you.
I mean,
Keep going.
Our society says like you should all be like us.
Right. So let me help you with that in our own way. Here's the way I look at that. No two people are alike. No two people are alike. Every single person has their own profile on Earth. What we don't do is understand the profile, where they're at, and how to intervene at that point in intervening. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Because if it isn't, that's the way I want you to think of it, from my perspective.
I guess what I sort of lost my...
Well, that's right. It'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Because you may be talking about somebody who's oppositional.
No,
and they're challenged to their own way.
I guess it's just, I think in terms of epigenetics, the environment is going to...
Yeah, go ahead. Say more about the environment now.
Developmental stages, and everyone develops at a different rate. So with the understanding that they are going to be potty trained, for example, you know, if they don't do it by 4, don't freak out.
Right, okay, I'm with you now. Here's the deal. Gifted boys, a lot of them can't ride a bike when their same age peers can. What does that do to them psychologically? Developmentally, they compare themselves to a normative. So what are they? They're immediately a failure, by the way, in their male image. So that's not simple for a kid like that. That is a very complex, deep developmental issue. If you understand the nature of gifted development, you will know that their physiological developmental lags are part of their giftedness. You have to know that information. That's why I'm here to tell you. I can't tell you all of this in one night. Why? Because it's impossible. Because you have a special needs situation. But that developmental piece has to do with the same thing we're talking with executive function. Their executive function is not going to develop the same rate as somebody who's less gifted than them and looks like they're performing much higher. And they're going to compare themselves to that gifted person. Or they're going to see somebody who they think is average ability who's doing better than them, and they're going to. But if you go in there and say to them, listen, this is where you are. We will not do that with children. We're afraid to do that with children. So there's a lot more to the where they're at thing, that in the ego of the gifted child. I have a slide on that somewhere in here, the ego thingy. Oh wait, I missed planning. This is a huge one. This isn't one of those I'm going to say I make assumptions in education about. We assume people know how to plan all over the place. Forget it, folks. You have to teach people how to plan. That's the intervention. You have to teach your child planning. We're going on a trip in 3 weeks. We're going to start planning tonight. Get out your Excel, your inspiration program, whatever you use, and you start the process and you walk them through the steps. And you teach them how to plan. The teachers can't teach them all that, and some of them aren't allowed, by the way, and want to. But you've got to teach them planning. Planning is a process in the prefrontal cortex. But I'm going to keep going through these. You get to talk
Do you see a big difference in that? I know you say it needs to be taught, but in some level of an innate ability for planning for boys versus girls?
Yeah, girls are better, depending on what you're planning. But yeah, generally. There's a lot, girls are a lot better generally with executive function. The problem for me with the gifted aspect of it is when the gifted girl actually has a problem with it, she's hyper vigilant around it. And so what happens is she's creating stress in her physiology. And she's creating stress in her life, how she's relating to people. It can come out in all different ways, typically, right? So the girl doesn't know that she has a problem, because why? She's typically the mother that comes in with a stack of notebooks and is taking notes and has all her files in a big pile, and she's voraciously trying to keep up with me, you know, and trying to make sure she gets exactly what she's supposed to do down. You know, there's no time to breathe or care about her feelings. It's all about, I have to fix this kid, right? No, you're not one of those parents. So, but that's an example of the apple fell from the tree and got stuck in the branch. You know? But the mother's not going to see that. She's not going to see that. She's going to be stressed out of her mind trying to plan everything, trying to organize everything.
Can I say?
Yeah, go ahead.
So that story he's telling about, to clarify the question about girls versus boys and executive function, the way I see it is that female brains may have a slight edge with their frontal cortex development, but what they really have an edge in is compensation. So
yeah.
girls and boys, gifted girls and boys, probably the girls are a little bit less dysfunctional in their executive function, but basically they can look a lot better. But it comes out in the anxiety and in the stress, and then they grow up into women who were never diagnosed or never realized they had these issues and vulnerabilities, and they become overcompensating stress balls and controlling, crazy, you know, that kind of personality. That's the way that
And I also, I don't want to paint them, I love that, what you said. They're good. We also see girls who are equally, if not more dysfunctional than boys too, by the way. But I'm talking a little bit in the general sense. So sustaining, this is an interesting prefrontal cortex issue. This is where you go to a score, you're working with a parent, and they say, well, I know they can do it. I've seen them do it up to this point. I've seen them do it before. I've seen them do it over there. Where the reality is, yes, they can muster up their prefrontal cortex to do things. They can't sustain it. So what happens in February and March? We become quite wealthy. Because the school year, right? The school year, but then August is hell, believe me, it's tough. But the school year basically is in its third phase of the 4 phases. So this is where you're in the production stage of process, where it's become mundane, where they have to really be into the rigor. They have to sustain all this now across the board. And guess what happens? It starts to drop. And it drops sometimes dramatically and no one believes it. Oh, he must be depressed. Well, yeah, he is depressed now. But what's happening is it's an executive function related problem. Because the symptom is sustaining. And that, by the way, sustaining works this way. If the class is 45 minutes, you're going to have a cycle of sustaining in that. If the day is a day, you're going to sustain for so long in the day. For the week, for the 9 weeks, for whatever you want to say. So it's a period that you're looking at. And you're looking at patterns when you look at sustaining issues. So we see this pattern a lot. You're working with it right now. Where, every year, the gifted kids doing really well, and then all of a sudden they start to slip. There's little things that they're missing, a D here and there when they're usually getting A's or even lower grades. And everybody's like, well, there's nothing really wrong, blah, blah, blah. Well, if it's been happening for 3 or 4 years in a row, it's an issue. So you have to look at the whole profile, and you have to consider the ability to sustain. The other thing is things need to be adjusted at that point. Loads need to be changed. People need to do better preparation. Be prepared for that know that about yourself. Emotional control. The amygdala in the brain gets out of control when the frontal lobe isn't controlling it. So when these kids dysregulate emotionally, this part of the brain, this is very simplified, but when this part of the brain gets dysregulated, the amygdala, and they get out of control, and then you try to get them back in control with reason or something, forget it. Once they've dysregulated into a fit or a meltdown, all they need right then is to be safe. Don't battle with them. Don't reason with them. Love them. Love them to death. Quietly, yes.
Talk to them.
Don't just be there. Make sure they're safe. And don't even try to get them to do their work. Because guess what's happened? Their frontal lobe is gone. When people get depression and their frontal lobe goes, it can go for years. I've been working on a brilliant case for 6, 7 years now of a brilliant human being who never got diagnosed. It was a woman. She lost her prefrontal cortex functioning now. She's been in treatment for 10 years and it's just now coming back. And what people try to do with her in the therapeutic process is they try to talk to her about going back to work, going back to that life. Well, you know what it does to her? Puts her in a panic. You can't do that with people so when your little kid loses it, they've lost it. They're offline. They need a day to recover. Their neural system is shut. They need love and affection, and then you can work on helping them understand that process. But somebody had their hands up or something. Way back there. You were jumping out of your seat, you two.
If you come and live with families. Well, you say, the meltdown, whatever.
Well, I temporarily lived with her family once. I nearly killed myself. No, I hate children. Y'all are nuts. I know what I put my mother through. I'd never have one of those of my own. No, I won't live with you. But thank you for the offer. It's very kind. I'd be like, The Sound of Music, Maria. Yeah. Go ahead.
So do you have any suggestions? So my 6-year-old.
Well, only when I get through all these, then I will. But go ahead, give me the problem set.
So my 6-year-old just most times completely melts down when we're trying to leave the house.
Oh,
Any
try.
purpose.
Pardon?
Good purposes, bad purposes. He needs to go to school. I mean, he loves his school, but he doesn't want to go. You know what I mean? Like if we're leaving the house, he just loses it. So what do I?
Well, there's no quick fix to that, but part of what's happening is he's having trouble with transitioning. Oh, there you go. Look at that. Perfect.
I can't stand there and love him.
No. Well, you can beat him. If you don't want to love him, you can hate him. I mean, here's the deal. There's a lot going on. But part of it is it...
I love him, for the record.
I don't know how much prep. I'd have to analyze a little further. I don't know how much preparation's happening the night before.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, but see, that's diagnostic though. Because first of all, when someone tells me something like that, I often say, okay, well, I'd have to do a little more exploring about what you're actually doing and not doing in terms of helping with transitions. So a lot of times, the transitions are of lack of preparation the night before. And there's no way you're going to activate that child, that kind of child in the morning without preparation ahead of time and without routine. And the other thing is, the time you're telling them probably needs to be adjusted. One trick is, you tell them you're leaving at 6. So their mind is prepared at 6 and you leave at 6:15. Okay? You can be the late one. But there's a lot to that. But if you have a problem where the child just really does that consistently and fights with you on a regular basis, you need to get help. I'm just telling you flat out. You need to get help.
I didn't know that before.
Well, then you need to get help. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to understand behaviorally and emotionally what's going on for the child and why they're dysregulated. Because realistically, a gifted kid can be showing you a symptom to a problem that's light years somewhere else. And people don't get that. They don't realize that it's not that connected. When a child who's gifted is giving you a symptom, you have to be a spy. You have to investigate all kinds of environmental situations to figure that out. So if a child has a project due in 3 months, they may exhibit symptoms today in response to having to do that executive function demand in 3 months. And you as adults know that reality, by the way. You know if you have a project coming up down the road at work, or a big assignment, or you have to fire somebody in a month, or something like that, you know what it does to you. But we forget that with a child. We think, well, that couldn't possibly be. That's 3 months from now. Or that's 3 weeks from now for that assignment is due. No, with a gifted child, it's very much in their brain. Remember, they're worried about failure. They're worried about success. They're worried about how they're going to do it. They're worried about how to save face in their egos. All that kind of stuff is going on with them when they have those demands. But this transitioning thing is huge. This is what we call rigid inflexibility. This is a big problem in general, but when a gifted person is rigidly inflexible, they are a nightmare. You ever known any of them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay? You have to point out to them that that rigidity is a problem that they have to work through. Because what happens is they become very dependent on what they do well, where they can muster the executive function, but they can't transition it to this problem, and this problem, and this problem. And that's not good. Because they need those skills. They need to transition and evolve those skills. And that's just one example. This happens in the marriage, right? In relationships, where people become rigidly inflexible in their position. Well, you know what? That's a symptom of a problem. That's not because you're a lousy spouse, you know, or you're doing something wrong. It's because they're stuck in their rigidity.
You mentioned before the difficulty of imposing upon an adolescent, for example, how to control an impulse, yet at the same time, the importance of teaching some of these executive function skills. So if you could address that balance a little bit.
Yeah, real directly. Here's how it works. Yeah. You first explain to them their gifted nature.
Yeah.
You first explain to them that your sense about their executive function issues. You explain to them what executive function is. And then you have a dialogue about how it plays out in your life when they're calm. So you lay a preset in their brain so they understand Mom is talking about, these are the problems I have with being gifted and having problems with executive function. These are problems for gifted kids. This is what I do when I do that. So when that event happens, you can sit back and say, later, that's what I was talking about. You do this with your kid a lot. You go back and you explain how you do it. We talked about
I
it.
got 2 of these guys. I got a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, both highly gifted, both with loads of executive function problems, among other things. So I live this all the time. When there's something like this going on, what Andy said is exactly how I do it. My kids know all about their brains. They've been assessed. We know what's going on. But even if you don't, you can still explain executive function. We know these words in our house, executive function, all those subfunction words. And when something comes up like this, I put it into that context, but not in the moment that they're crazy. I do it when they're not crazy. And I say that all the time. I run parent groups and we talk to them when they're not crazy. To me, in my house, that's Saturday morning. That's the only time of the week that they're not under school stress or thinking about school stress or wiped out from school. It's Saturday morning. So when they're not crazy is when you sit down. The other thing I would add to that is that you compose a short list of maybe 5 examples of this behavior that you write out and present to them in a piece of paper so that they can grasp and have a framework in their brain of what you're talking about. And if you can do that and just lay out the information, that's all that's needed to start. They're not going to, by the way, say, wow, Mom, you are totally right. I get it. Thank you so much.
So let's go with that, with adolescent development, though. Hold on a second. This is very important. In adolescent development, they don't take information in and spit it back at you in agreement. They do that up until adolescence, pre-adolescence. If it's a gifted child, that's going to be different. So when they're in that adolescent development, they integrate that stuff in their late 20s, 30s, 40s. And you have to, and if you don't understand that, developmentally, if you don't understand that, you're going to not be okay. She's right about finding the place. You have to give them this information. You have to give them the base. They have to have this. They have no manual. You know, a lot of you want really quick solutions, and you're not going to get real quick solutions. You're going to get information. Information for the gifted person is very important, relatively. Then the next step is the things we're talking about, like what she was just describing, when you deliver it right now. But most of you don't even know that this exists in a sense. And they don't necessarily know that this is an issue for them in their lives. They don't think that it's really a problem at all because their egos. Organization, I don't need to say much about that, do I? Yeah.
To something she said. So if I wait, I understand the decompression time, etc. Let's say it's a serious issue and keeps on coming back. Yeah. I don't know, I just question, if I wait for an elongated amount of time, what tends to happen is my daughter forgets it, or loses its, it becomes a little less meaningful. How do you keep the meaning of the situation without losing its opportunity by waiting longer?
Okay, I'll explain that one. I don't know the context of your situation, okay, but here's the deal. If a person is in the moment of, we're talking about dysregulating, all right? If the person's in that state and you try to talk to them about it in that moment, just think of it, this is offline. It's not working. It's not working. So what you have to do is you have to go back to the child, what Jennifer's talking about. We talk about predict and prescribe. You have to go back with your list of behaviors. You can't just take one. You have a series. You say, okay, I got this list. I could be wrong. I always say come at them ambivalently. I could be wrong, but on this date, at this time, at this hour, I could be wrong. There's a reason I do that strategically. It is a strategy. Because the mind has to see the pattern. If you just confront them with one instance, in that moment, they're going to put you in a loop. And they're brilliant at loops. And you people are all good at this. You'll loop and loop and loop and loop. And I'll say, well, you know what? But if you give them a pattern where their brain has to say, oh, really? It happened on Monday, it happened 3 weeks ago, it happened, that happened at so-and-so. Their brain basically starts to process that differently. And they can't come back at you with the loop. They have to realize there's something else going on here for me. And that's the critical thing there. That's why Jennifer says, you know, give them a list. You've got to, and you have to make things very concrete with these kids. You can't talk to them, in essence. You can't just auditorily give some, because a lot of people with executive function problems also have auditory processing issues, attentional issues, right? We haven't gotten into auditory processing tonight. But people with auditory processing issues also have executive function issues. Why? Because your auditory processing is what helps develop your executive function. So when parents are talking to a child verbally, blah, 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 right? They're not processing that. They're hearing, blah, 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 right? That's all they're hearing. And they're not processing the auditory. So the written things, that's why you write things down for them and you follow through with them and you don't just talk to them in that sense. But we can do a lot more on that one. Pacing. Here's an example. This is about regulating the body, pacing yourself in something. Anybody see this problem with the child? I want to kind of get through this. Self-monitoring. This is your ability to step back from yourself and kind of look at everything that's going on with you at once. But if you're hyper-focused or your mind is bent on this and you're rigid, you're not necessarily going to self-monitor everything. That's where you could come up with some kind of a list. Now, when you're working on that project, you gotta look at this, you gotta look at this, you gotta look at this, you gotta pay attention to what time it is, but you help them with all those things. Now, I'm gonna ask you a question. I like having administrative assistants. I don't have as much as I should have and have had. But if I have administrative support at my office, does anybody have a problem with that? You don't? Okay, so some of you want a solution. Hire your child an administrative assistant. How many of you have a problem with that? I think you pay for it. You're mean. Seriously, how many of you would have a problem? All right, if you can afford it, how many of you would have a problem with it? Seriously, be honest now. Come on. Oh, all right, thank you. Now you're being real. Okay, now the group therapy can start.
I am the administrative assistant.
Pardon? I like that. And you know what? It's okay to be their administrative assistant. Are you enabling them? In most cases, no, you're not really. Teachers sometimes will make you think that. Your spouse may want you make you think that. But what's happening basically is whether or not they're using your assistants in an effective way. And you have to teach them how to use the assistant effectively. Because for most of them, that's what they're going to need in life. Nobody does anything alone. And when you have executive function problems, some of them really don't matter. It doesn't matter to me that I can't spell. Or I can't organize certain things in my life. I don't really care. But what matters to me is whether or not I know that I need somebody to do that for me if I want to be effective. And that I'm willing to work with people on that. Because nobody does it alone. It just doesn't happen.
Well,
Yeah.
if I'm hearing you correctly, that's kind of part two of what you're saying when we sit down and tell them about themselves, and we come up with 5 examples or something, but we have to tell them that these are skills that you have to learn. And if we're going to be their assistant or someone's going to help them.
Well, you know what? Here, we're going to get to that issue in a minute because let me jump to it real quick. Working memory. Basically, executive function issues are working memory issues. All right? That's kind of the way Russell Barkley, the ADD expert, looks at it. So basically, all those subfunctions are all working memory. What is working memory? Your ability to pull up information online and to process it in a way that you can create, solve problems, make things happen, get things done, do things. We're talking a lot tonight about internal working memory. We're not talking a lot about external working memory, you know? But people have fabulous external working memory in terms of their physical abilities too, which oftentimes, by the way, we don't see that as giftedness. You know, we think of giftedness as an academic ability, but you know what? People can be gifted in driving a backhoe. My 12-year-old neighbor drives a massive backhoe on the farm, and he is very good at it. Now, how many of you would let your child drive a backhoe? Now, if they were a gifted child, you might think about it. You would? You like that idea?
I totally would.
What did you say?
I totally would, and she would do it too.
Exactly, and she would do it. I like that even better. Let's talk about completion. This is a biggie, and this is the end of the subfunctions. Most people never complete anything. So I have a little technique I use. I have this thing I do in my head. It's a mantra I use to get myself to finish work. It's called complete the task, complete the task, complete the task. Because I literally have to activate my brain to complete a task. I can't let it go. Now, I am really a carpenter. And so my house is really nice, and I've built lots of things. And there are all these little things that never quite get completed, right? So then I go back around eventually, and I complete them. But it takes a while. That's an external working memory problem, right? In terms of completing just that little piece of trim that drives everybody nuts, and then when you're ready to sell the house, you finally finish it. Not in this next house. It's all going to be done ahead of time, I promise. Why not? You have your hand up? No? Somebody? Somebody over here? Oh. There's a squirrel moment in my visual. All right. Relationships, physical, spiritual, vocational, financial. Executive functioning affects everything. I'm going to talk about church for a minute. You take a kid to church who has executive function problems, ADD, auditory processing. All right, so I was raised Catholic. That is torturous for the child. But what happens is this. Nobody translates over, let's put giftedness on top of it, right? They don't really understand all that stuff, but they understand just enough to be dangerous and challenging. But they're also struggling with the idea of having to sit there for an hour through a mass. All right? Now that's physical torture for a child with this problem. It's psychological torture on some level because they don't quite get it all. They're looking, so everything's out of whack, isn't it? So then they grow up and they learn to what? Hate the church. Why? They think it's because of the dogma only. It isn't all about the dogma. A lot of it could have been because they were being tortured in the environment of the church. I'm super sensitive to smell. When they had what was that? What's the mass they do when they do the incense? Easter, right? I haven't been there in a while. Please forgive me, Father. But seriously, but let me tell you something. I was just telling them tonight. I can smell a dead rodent anywhere. I have the weirdest sense of smell.
Is it a common trait in gifted people?
Only certain gifted
My
people.
daughter's that way. Like smell is just.
All right, so here's the deal. Remember, we'll go back to the beginning. It's human behavior in extremes. So we're not going to get into the overexcitability stuff, but that's good stuff. It's Dabrowski stuff. But here's the deal. It's all independent on the individual. Some people have super sensitive systems. Some people have super sensitive hearing. They can hear the flowers opening. And people think they're nuts. Right? Some people can smell something that other people can't. Great pathologists have the ability to do that. That's why they become pathologists. When they're a kid, you think they're a freak. But guess what? Or you think it's a problem if they're super sensitive as a child and they cry over everything. When they grow up, what do they become? Me. You know? I'm not just a big old Nelly. I'm a sensitive guy who really understands feelings, right? But that stuff has to be regulated and developed. It's a part of their nature, but most people don't see it as giftedness. That their executive function is what plays a part in developing that sensory or whatever it is. It's your ability to take that part of yourself and get this part of the brain to regulate with it and develop it. So when we ignore this stuff totally and we just go carte blanche, wild, you know, then things get way out of control. Or when we get caught up in the gifted ego stuff, you know, the gifted nature, what contributes to it? It's both, school and home contribute. Is it nature versus nurture? It's everything. Everything's going on here. There's so many systems involved in the process. Lack of early match challenge. Why don't gifted kids' executive functions get developed early on? Because we don't think it's an issue. And we focus on what? What they're good at. We don't realize how far they really are on the curve. They really are out there. So we don't realize how developmentally they're different and what kind of scaffolding they need and what kind of challenges they need in that process. So things get way ahead, other things get lag behind.
Will you clarify, when you say match challenge, you are not only talking about advanced development, you are talking about the match
Scaffolding?
challenge to scaffolding things that are vulnerable as well.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I wasn't explaining it well. So when you explain it,
Right.
that's good.
This statement is important, and it can be misinterpreted. In sort of the wider gifted land that I kind of call the normal gifted land, which is not us, when people talk about a match challenge, they're talking typically about matching the child's advanced ability with advanced academic.
I'm not talking about that.
What this statement means in this room tonight is match challenge for not only where they're advanced, but also in areas where they're behind. The match challenge, matching where they're at. So specifically in this case, a child with lagging executive function needs to have much more scaffolding of teaching in that area when they're young than they get. And then at the other hand, matching where they may be advanced as well, so that they're getting that need met as well. But that vulnerability area is often overlooked.
Right. So then the gifted nature is this. It's independent generally. They come into the world typically with this sense of, I can do this on my own. It's a part of human nature to become independent that way. Then what happens with some gifted people, they become overly onto this nature of having to be independent. And that's not reality. Because why? Because we're human beings are there. We thrive through human connection. And so when you get caught up in that game of they're, making them really independent and all that kind of, they're really into that dynamic, they're losing their humanness in that too. Because nobody does it alone in any way, shape, or form. So that contributes to the issue. ego development. Why? Because the gifted brain is such that they can develop a really strong ego really fast in life. So people can become very guarded to their vulnerabilities and not wanting to face them. So here you have a kid that has these issues, but their giftedness is out of whack. I mean, they are really guarded against anything that represents a vulnerability for them. Now that's tricky, right? So what I tell people is don't run home and try to employ some kind of behavioral technique with your child around their executive function tonight. You go home and talk more about what you're understanding about the complexity of giftedness and how hard it is to manage the extremes of being ahead and the extremes of being behind in some ways, and how you have to integrate that in life, and how you have these beliefs that you should be perfect, they should be able to do it all on your own. That's where you start. Because if you try to put something behavioral in place with a gifted person and just executive function, them to death, you'll fail. It's not going to work. It doesn't work at all. But if you hit the nail on the head and you help them first with their ego and their vulnerability, remember, underneath all that, any sense of failure, it's really a moral failure in their minds. So there's a denial of vulnerability with gifted people. They deny that they could have a problem with executive function. So if we go back to the technique of it all, it's really about helping them understand what is gifted. That's my point. Really, understanding the nature of their giftedness. We talked about that, didn't we? Exponential effect. I'm not going to talk about that. The entity view of gifted, that's when it's all about the goal, where it's all about Harvard, Yale, MIT, savior of the world, grades, grades, grades. And let me tell you, that is the paradigm a lot of you live in. I've been told that giftedness is all about. Grades, grades, grades. First of all, if your child is gifted and they're getting all, in elementary school, they're getting all A's, you have a problem. You have a real problem if your child's getting all A's. Now, I'm sure that gets a little, you're going. Why do I have a problem with that? Anybody? Pardon?
Not challenged?
Yeah, there's no feedback, there's no challenge, grades are supposed to be about feedback. You're supposed to get critical feedback. So this is what I would tell people. Most of you go to work and you don't focus at work what you're good at. And you don't get upset because you go to work and you focus on what you want to improve. Most of us go to work every day to improve ourselves. We're always spending our day solving a problem, looking how we can be better at a problem. And we have no problem with that. Why? Because we're getting challenged. We know ourselves. We know that's what it's worth in life. We do the opposite with gifted children, don't we now? It's all about what? Praising them for what they're good at, having to be good at everything, having to be the best, having to get good grades. That's a little crazy, folks. We all participate in it.
Isn't there also the issue of being set up, not being able to fail, allowing them to fail? They need to be able to get that B, C, and then...
Yeah, they need to be challenged. They need
No,
critical
also
feedback.
to have
They need to understand
to
the
not be
process.
perfect, and
Right.
to fail, to be able
Exactly.
to fail.
But if that's not embedded, if it's all about the grade, and it's all about teaching to the test, and it's all about how well you answer the bubbles, then you know what? We're not teaching. We're not learning. That's destroying working memory, by the way. Okay, so here's a process of change. There's three things here. One is the relationship. If your child is struggling with executive function, nothing's going to change if you don't have the right relationship set up with your child to address the issue. So if the child thinks you're coming at it from a performance standpoint and not because of your relationship, it's not going to work. Assessment and awareness. You really do need to have assessment on some level. You need some facts, some understanding about their gifted profile. I'm a big believer in assessment, but it has to be done right. Assessment in gifted land is oftentimes only done for what purpose? To promote and accelerate them in a gifted program. It should be done for a learning profile. It should be done so you understand their developmental nature, what you can do to help them integrate their strengths and their vulnerabilities. That's what they need. So you can spend all the time you want behaviorally trying to help their executive function. If it doesn't work, go back to assessment. That's what I tell people when I train them. If you're stuck with a case, you go back to assessment. Why? Because you don't know what's going on. You've got to know what's going on. When you have good assessment, you can have good intervention. And that intervention has got to be tailored to who they are individually in that process. And then that creates the integration. By the way, we talk a lot in Gifted Land about differentiation. But guess what? You can't have differentiation without integration. We never talk about integration. We're always talking about differentiation. That's another topic. Oh, we did that. All right, back to the basics. Oh, good, I have some time. Now we can talk about what to do. Again, it's back to this. Oops. It's the achievement gap again, right? I just don't want you to forget that. Executive functioning has a lot to do with processing and working memory. So if we increase processing, we increase working memory. Processing is input. It's how you take information into the brain, how you code it. Think of it this way. It's how you take information and lay it effectively into memory. Why? For retrieval. Recall. You can pull the information back up effectively on demand when you need it. You can hold it in time and space, and you can solve problems, create, express yourself, be integrative, right? That's what we want to have happen. We want working memory to work. So before executive function, we're really talking about how you're processing information, how you're taking it from your ability to take information in. Gathering data, sensory, how you process it. Now retrieval, that's all about, in a sense, I don't like to say it's totally about output, but output has to do with how you take that information, how you express it. I think I said all this, didn't I? I'm ahead of myself. Good for me. I'm going to jump. Processing skills. Build executive function. Your ability to take information in, lay it effectively into memory, whether you're working in a physical field or an intellectual information field, it's all the same issue. Creativity, problem solving, expression, communication. These all activate your development. If a person is not processing well, guess what happens? Their development stops. So if your kid has processing issues, which are what? They have ADD, executive function, auditory process, sensory motor, all those processing things are going on, they're going to affect the child's ability to activate development. We put a lot of focus, obviously, on processing, don't we? We want to thrive over survive, by the way. Grocery store of the mind. So here's the deal. You're taking information in, how's it organized in your mind? How is it going in? Is it organized? Is the person really hearing the information? Are they coding it effectively? So let's talk about listening. What we put emphasis on in our practice is communication. So not only do we work with you, with your kids on the basic things you do academically and other ways, we train kids how to communicate effectively. From scratch, literally. So what they're taught to do is how to listen. Not just to words, to thoughts, I don't mean to sound cliche, to feelings and behavior. And we process that, whether they're able to do that. And they don't get to move forward until they can. So when we run a group, we're literally indoctrinating them into this process. It's a cult. And we're literally training their auditory processing, their language processing, their expression. We're teaching them how to listen better in a contained space with real listening skills. So if somebody speaks, we're teaching them how to express themselves, and we're teaching the other person how to listen to what they said. The thoughts, the feelings, and the behavior of what they said. And they can't go forward until the other person feels heard. And then we teach them what that really means to be heard. Because most people don't know what it means to really be heard in life. Once you get heard in life, your whole life changes forever. What we don't do is we don't teach anybody how to really communicate. So what you're going to see happen in the world is this. Everyone is going to go back to the basics. You see it in business now. You see people doing workshops on it again. It's cycling around. Why? Because it's the only way human beings connect. And we are connecting beings, and we need to connect to thrive. If we don't connect, we're dead in the water. We also use, I don't know if you get into it tonight, we do a lot of work with assisted listening devices. Kind of like a hearing aid, but it's where the person's own voice is mic'd up also. So they're hearing their own voice in real time. Because not only do you process information as it comes in, you need to be able to improve your processing of what you're saying when it goes out. So have you ever been accused of being a liar, or your kid, you think they're lying? And they're not really lying. They're forgetting they said it. They've not coded it into memory. They might remember 3 weeks later, and you'll say, you said you didn't do that. And then they remembered it. because they couldn't automatically retrieve. Because of the processing, note-taking. All right, this is my big one here. The number one way to increase a person's executive function in the classroom, the processing, is note-taking. Now, what's happened to note-taking in our society? I see some of you taking notes. What's happened? Guess what? We've annihilated it. Children are never taught how, generally, they're not taught how to take notes at all. The number one thing you can do in an academic setting or any learning setting to increase processing is note-taking. If anyone ever says to you, put down your pens and papers and all eyes up here so you can hear me better, they're an idiot. I don't mean to be mean to that teacher who does that, but the fact is, that doesn't work. I was just kidding, by the way, they're not really idiots. The fact is, it doesn't work. It actually does the opposite. It shuts down the processor. We actually teach people, even if they're dysgraphic, we don't care if you can read it. We know this. If you write it, you'll remember it. If you can't read it, you can develop the skill to write better. That's a muscle thing. And we teach people that. And it will take many years. So everyone knows me who comes to work with me. You'll learn to take notes. You'll take notes. And if you're with me for 10 years, eventually you'll take notes. And then you know what will happen? Like one of my clients, he was brought up to the front of the class in college. He could not take notes 3 months prior. And he worked with me for many years. And his teacher used him as an example of his note-taking. Why? Because eventually his development kicked in. Brilliant guy, couldn't write. Couldn't write at all. He is a magnificent writer. He's won awards at his school for writing. Okay? He's 28. He couldn't write a couple years ago. He never thought of himself as a writer. That's the nature of gifted development when you have his asynchronous. But note-taking, I can't say enough about it. It has to be put back into our system. And you will see people will start doing it. People are going to get smart. We're going to go back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's what's going to happen. Pre-teaching. This is where the night before you get the information for your kid, what's going to be taught in the class the next day. I'm emphasizing this because it's a really good technique for anybody, but for the gifted kid who's struggling with executive function in the classroom. You pre-teach them. You give them an overview. Tomorrow in class, the teacher's going to teach this, this, and this. So you have the textbook at home or the information from the teacher, and you don't have to do it every night. You can do it every other night. You can do it every night if you want. But yeah, of course, again, you have to get the kid in a relationship with you to do this. All right, so I'm giving you some ideas here that you can't necessarily employ.
You know, we also use pre-teaching with developmentally delayed kids for
Exactly.
a lot of social situations.
Exactly, and we use them with gifted
Before we go
kids.
into that store, we're going
and
to
social.
say, this is what I expect, this
Right.
is what's next. And it's interesting to think about that in academic.
Well, let me go back to my bell curve just for a minute. So when we look at the profile of profoundly gifted kids, typically, or highly gifted kids in those profiles, a lot of the scatter is out all over the place on that other end of that curve. And then you have some scatter that is at the other end, in the 2 percentile, what we used to call mental retardation. And guess what? If your kid has a 2 coding score, or is in the 2nd percentile, or 4 coding score, guess what? They have a serious problem. And the people working with that child need to understand that. That is a serious problem.
And a lot of those techniques that you're describing would be appropriate almost exactly in that form for that gifted child too.
Because it's a developmental issue, just like it would be on the other end of that continuum, right? So preparing somebody for a lecture, you know, the person has to learn how to be prepared for a lecture. They have to go in with what they need to do. They have to know that they can take notes. They have to position themselves in the classroom. We're not going to get into all that. I'm just giving it. We really work with people based on their processing, where they should be strategically in a classroom. So if I go to a school, I want to know where the kid is in every classroom. And we're going to optimize that, right? Those are just things you can think about. Same with this is what goes on in classrooms today. Have you ever been into one of those classrooms? And if you have one, I'm sorry, but I'm going to vomit all over it. Where it's so much visual stimulation, you have a panic attack. Now, you know, we've done this with textbooks, by the way. College textbooks are ridiculous. We've done this over-visualization of college textbooks to the point where they're worthless. And I'm an expert on reading a college textbook and how to study one. They are worthless pieces of crap. Because it's all this visual stuff with little pieces of blah, 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 blah. And you know what? It ain't working, folks. It's not helping reading comprehension. We haven't even gotten to reading yet. Project management. It has to be supervised, folks. You need rubrics. You need to plan ahead. Pick one project. Tell your kid ahead of time. Say, you know, we're going to work on this project. We're not going to wait till the last minute. We're going to have a rubric. We're going to use our Excel spreadsheet, all that kind of stuff, right? Let's talk about reading comprehension. We can't get a lot into it, but this is really, in general, you have a lot of gifted kids who are voracious readers, right? You really got to understand their reading profile, because having a voracious reader doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good thing. Okay? Why? Because the information is going in, and it's getting dumped in there, isn't it now? But guess what?
There's no help.
Well, there's no output either for a reason. Focus on what's happening. They're going to do really good in Jeopardy. They're going to go really good on a standardized test with a bubble scan. And because why? They're given the cues to prompt their retrieval. But what they're not going to be good at anymore is how to write, how to solve problems, how to be creative with that information and use that information effectively. And that's what we're doing in education. And for the gifted child, we're doing a lot of that, aren't we? We're just filling their little heads with information all over the place, and we're giving them lots of bubble tests. And we're all playing right into it. But all that information is getting dumped in, and when they have executive function problems, guess what they're not doing? Organizing it effectively. Why? Because they will read voraciously, but they don't necessarily have the metacognitive frameworks of how to take their information and store it. They don't know how to necessarily analyze what they're reading, organize it, and put it into the brain, and annotate it. Annotation. Jennifer teaches a summer program where she teaches, how do you say it? She teaches the brain, you tell them.
What are you?
Your summer writing class, your boot camp. I was going to explain it, but you explain it.
Well, I'm not sure what you want me to explain about it.
What you do in your boot camp for writing and...
It's a 1-week-long course. We spend 5 half days, 3 hours a day for 5 days in a row, writing one 5-paragraph essay. So I spend 15 hours, and the output is one 5-paragraph essay. And we go from learning the neuroscience and language processing, these are the kids and the parents are in this class together, to learning how to read appropriately, how to use mind mapping software to organize it, to creating an outline and a draft, and taking notes on the text, the whole thing. I walk them through every bit of it, and the final product is a edited one essay like that.
And give them the age range.
From a 10-ish, depending on how mature they are, through adult.
Through adult. What we find, and this is a big problem with gifted kids today, they literally don't know how to write. And what we'll do is we'll analyze their writing. Someone will come in and say, well, my kid doesn't have a problem with writing. And we'll read it, and what it'll be is a nice long chronology of facts. Really interesting facts. But there's no problem solving in it. There's no contribution to the body of literature. There's nothing going on in that regard. It's just a lot of good information that they spewed back in a way to impress the teacher. And they have formulas they use to get the teacher off their trail. So it was not, when I was in the 4th grade, I had Mrs. Johnson. She was always what I said was my favorite teacher. You know why? Because every time there was a written language assignment, because I was a profoundly gifted artist, I would go up to Mrs. Johnson. I was really cute back then, before I became a gangly, ugly adolescent, and then, whatever happened, I don't know. But I would go up to her and I'd say, Mrs. Johnson, I'd like to do a bulletin board, because I'm really good at that. And she'd say, okay, Andy, you can do a bulletin board, because my bulletin board's kicked ass. You know what I mean? Right? So there's my visual, blah, I vomited all over the class from Andy, right? And guess what Andy got to do? Manipulate himself out of every written language assignment in the 4th grade. And then the 5th grade, the 6th grade. I did this all the way through high school. Now, when you're a gifted person and you can't do something and it bothers you that you can't do it, that means you have an ability in it. If it doesn't bother somebody that they can't read well or write well or build something well, it's not an issue, really, typically. But if it bothers them at some point that they can't really sing or they can't really read the way they want to, it's because they have the ability. They have the gift. But this asynchrony is going on. I want to say something about research. Jennifer was talking about how to write the paper. This is another one of those executive function things in schools we don't teach children how to do. You have to teach your child how to do research if the school isn't. They need to know how to gather source information, annotate it. We use inspiration.com software. I love it. I highly recommend it. Some of you are nodding your heads. We talked about expository. I talked about the ALD. Dragging software is good, but I like people to alternate when they use dictation software. You know, I don't like people just to do straight dictation unless physically that's absolutely what they have to do. And that's me. But now we have just a few minutes before we go anywhere. Any of those questions, by the way? Which ones? First one. Oh, yeah, these are for the introverts in the crowd. Yes. When gifted individuals inherently love executive functioning issues due to their heightened sensory awareness and multi-potentiality. Do they love executive functioning issues? They usually hate executive function.
Do they have?
Oh, do they have? I'm sorry, I see love everywhere. If it looks like love, I'm reading love. Do they have? Yes, they typically have executive function. You can generalize, say that executive functioning issues are generally a problem with more highly gifted people. Okay? So the further out you get, the more likelihood is that they're struggling with issues related to executive function. Now remember, you can have executive function type of these issues related to a lot of different learning style, profile things that are going on. But I just think it's good to know the subfunctions of executive function to begin your attempt to understand it. Are gifted and non-gifted children fundamentally different in their executive functions? I always say, again, back to it's human behavior in extremes. So it's how that person's asynchrony plays out. They may have the same executive function ability as their normal kind of peer, but because their general intelligence is way out there, they're going to have problems different than the person that's their chronological age peer who doesn't have the same profile. So their normative peer that's not gifted might function perfectly fine in school, where they're going to struggle at certain points. Does that make sense? It's just one constellation of that. How do executive function deficits affect ability to write? Well, let's do a little synopsis of that. That's your ability to organize, process information effectively into the brain. Remember, we can go back to the list. Planning, sustaining, organizing. Those are all, if you can just take writing. Research papers are the supremo executive function challenge. So is homework, by the way. Homework is all executive function. So we take a kid who's exhausted because they have executive function problems in school. We send them home, and what do? We tell them to go home and do executive function as their primary evening activity. Now that's a little nuts, folks. All right, what does therapy look like for adolescents who are gifted and experience social deficits? I believe in yachting cruises with their peers, so I would send them all off on a nice yacht trip together. It's really effective. All right, here's the deal with social issues. They don't have social deficits. What they have is they're missing the opportunity to be with like mind, like nature, like development, to activate their socialization. This has been a problem in gifted land forever. Gifted kids get labeled as antisocial or having deficits in social skills. I've been doing gifted groups for 30 years for this reason. When you bring together a very special group of gifted kids and you profile them as close together as you can, they have no problem whatsoever being social. But if you take one of those kids out and you drop them into a normal kind of peer, chronological age peer, they're going to have all kinds of social problems now, aren't they? And it's not going to be the other kid's problem, it's going to be your kid's problem. So do they really? No. That gets in, there's some other issues there with how people in their giftedness are able to read other people or understand themselves in relationship to others. Yeah, that can create social context issues, but in general, that's how we deal with that. I have a 2E child girl, gifted AD, wondering how to find the right fit for her high school and college. I'll tell you what we typically do is we send you to school placement specialists. And if you have the resources, that's a really good investment because they know what they're doing. And the ones I use, I have a couple that I'm developing a relationship with here. But there's one in particular I use in Washington, D.C. that they take the neuropsych profile and they use it. And they've been doing this with me literally, because I was there for 15, almost 20 years or some range working in DC. So they've all become educated in that process, how important it is to understand the gifted kid who's twice exceptional and the placement issues. So I would suggest that you can talk to us or we'll hook you up, or you look for somebody who specializes in that. All right, I'm going to answer one more of these. This little note. Should there be a consequence to their, oh, this is a good one. If a student doesn't fulfill school obligations because of executive function, should there be a consequences to their actions? Yeah, the consequence should be they should get help. They should get assessed. And if there's a history of it, you should bring them up for screening for eligibility for services.
Rather than giving them homework or more.
Thank you, Alan. He's right. Rather than giving them homework or consequences or punishment. You don't do that to a child like that. What you do basically is you assess their situation. Excellent, my friends. Thank you. All right, we didn't get to this misdiagnosis, but if I can take a minute. How often do you see misdiagnoses of children who are gifted and have been identified as having ADHD? I don't usually see it that way. The problem with people's assessment of ADHD is it's not really effectively assessed. And giftedness is not really assessed. So people get diagnosed with ADHD by going to a family physician sometimes. And they're basically put on medication and that's it. And a lot of us would totally disagree with that. And if you have a gifted child and they have symptoms of dysregulation and impulsivity and attention and all that, more than likely it's more than ADD. Or and necessarily it doesn't mean it's ADHD. It could be anxiety, it could be something else going on. That's why, again, we work on assessment. We believe in it for these kids. We believe in thorough assessment, comprehensive. Because most times when a gifted kid comes in, they've been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. There's far more going on. And sometimes it's auditory processing issues with ADD, or it's more the other and not that. There's a lot to that complexity.
I think that was my question.
Oh.
When you have a child, though, that has had a diagnosis, and that child is on medication, and you notice improvements in their behavior whether or not they take that medication, does that necessarily mean that it truly is ADHD, or it's just general executive function deficits related to giftedness? Can you tease those
Can I
apart?
answer that one? I like the question.
Is that you, Andy?
Yeah.
This is super complex, and so I'm going to reiterate, first of all, that when we have a situation like that, if that story walked into my office, the first thing I would be saying is there needs to be more assessment. And the way that we do ultimately tease that apart is a combination of having that assessment done, but that often can take a while. There's a long wait for it. But there's a lot of factors that go into, and hints and things that we can find out from hearing the story of what's going on. But that can be a combination of attention problems, executive function problems, language processing problems, other sensory processing problems, and then all kinds of overlaid anxiety or other things. There's a whole host of things can be going on. And to figure out and tease out that complexity can often take a long time and require a lot of testing as well as a lot of time with us getting to know that child, that family, the whole situation. So it can be teased out, and we frequently do, but it can take a while to do so.
Yeah. Good question. There was one other thing. Somebody said, what coaching do you offer to help kids who have executive function deficits that significantly impact the speed at which they complete the homework? We actually do. Mark and Garrett and Jenny all do work with the gifted kids, and when we do academic coaching, there's a little bit of a counseling element to it. But some kids are geared for that automatically, so they can come in and we can literally work on executive function right away. And some gifted kids, we can't touch that. Don't go there, until we have some relationship with the child to help them understand themselves better. So we do offer that. And so in our process, it's very comprehensive. So when we work with a kid, we're all involved in every situation. So if you come to see us, you get to know all of us pretty much. So if your kid's in a group, then you get to work with all of us, or you're in a parent group at the same time, or we're doing family counseling or individual work. Because we know that these kids require an enormous amount of complex accommodation and support in that process, if that makes sense. Because there's a lot going on. And then eventually people say, well, how long does it take? 6 months to 2 years, literally. And then after that, it's just a matter of how much more work you want to do on yourself in that experience. But again, like Jennifer said, it's very complex, and we try to be extremely thorough. We want you to know that we want you to have a really good understanding of your profile to start. Somebody had their hand up over here.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm a holistic psychiatrist, so last week I gave a talk at Walsh Natural Health on natural approaches to ADD and ADHD. And nutrition, of course, is a huge thing. Nutrition, environmental, epigenetic factors, going beyond the genes to whatever we can change environmentally, which we often have to look at too. And the other thing that I'm seeing a lot, and I was wondering if you could comment on that, that was my question, was just, kids and adults just completely burning out with adrenal fatigue and thyroid fatigue.
Totally. Please don't go there.
Look at our society.
All right, so I have that fatigue at the moment.
Yeah, so I just wanted
I'm
to
into
mention
your
that.
stuff.
Because they're called depressed,
You have
and
to
then
bring
they
that
put on
up.
more meds.
Well, you have to end my evening on that note. I had to spend the day with the doctor on that whole adrenal fatigue thing. All right, we're with you, 100%. Say something real quick. Do you use Deplin? Have you used Deplin?
Oh yeah, I use all kinds of things, including Deplin.
Because we're seeing a lot of effect with Deplin, which is, just real quickly, give them an example of what Deplin is, as an example, as an alternative to Ritalin or something.
Well, it's a folate, it's a B vitamin, it's like a prescribed one. So I use them, actually I prefer to use live, raw, organic, vegan type products. So they're more nutraceutical and organic rather than pharmaceutical based. Deplin is more pharmaceutical based, but it is one of those approved.
Yeah, but there's an example of where the tide's changing. We're finally having some things
The
that aren't.
nutritional impact.
Right, but some cases people clearly need ADD medicine, and that's just some of the facts, the basic reality. We have to wrap it up, folks. Before you go, I have to say a few things. Okay, remind me. What was I supposed to cover before we go? Anything I need to share with these folks about us? This is our staff, by the way, and a few others aren't here, but
we have some basic information in the back about more on the service supervisor. We also have an email sign-up list if you want to know more about when he's other speaking engagements or information we can send you periodically. If anyone needs it.
Anything else you want to add? Your parent group? Don't go yet. I want to say goodbye to you appropriately. I'll just keep you in your seat.
I do parent groups. Raise your hand if you've been in one of my parent groups. 1, 2, awesome. So if anybody's interested in a support group as a parent of a gifted child, just, let's see.
My
card's not back there. You can send an email to
I want to
us.
also say something. Jennifer does a very specialized parent group, and then we also have parent groups that go along with our kids' groups.
Which I
So
also
they're a little different processes. One's a little more involved, what Jennifer does, than the other. But I have to say goodbye. But before I go, I just need a couple comments. Nice. So no more questions. Just say something nice. If you have any negative feedback, email it to me in a week. All I want right now is a sense of something you're taking with you from this evening from me. So I go home feeling really good. What has this done for you?
I'm extremely excited to start working with you.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Ditto.
Yeah.
I like that. Anybody else?
I was happy to be reminded not to try to insert myself too much into my child's meltdown and just recognizing that he's checked out and
He's gone.
Come
It's
back later.
offline. Think offline. It's offline. Yes, ma'am.
I think I've noticed how many things I'm not doing so well.
Okay. That's like my day at work every day. Before you get it.
For me, it's huge on the developmental piece and really being patient and working with the giftedness, but knowing that that it is a process that may take time to see the real.
Okay, that's the best summary I could have gotten out of the night, so we're going to end on that note. Thank you guys very much.